In this section, we'll look at President Woodrow Wilson's early reforms in the early years of his first term. But before we look at Wilson's progressive policies, it's interesting to look at him as a person. He was much different than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was outgoing and gregarious. Wilson was sort of reserved and intellectual. Roosevelt was bulky and muscular. Wilson was tall and thin. Roosevelt was Machiavellian. Wilson was idealistic. With Wilson, we have our first PhD, first and only PhD American president. He rose from the ranks of an assistant professor at Princeton University to its president, and Princeton was in New Jersey, so he parlayed that into the governorship of New Jersey. He did have one thing in common with Teddy Roosevelt, and that was both of them lost their beloved wives and suffered bereavement while still trying to carry on their political career. The first item on Wilson's legislative agenda was tariff revision. The Payne-Aldrich tariff, passed during Taft's presidency, kept rates high to protect big business. A lot of reformers said it aided large corporations and hurt small businesses and wanted reform. Wilson broke precedent all the way back to Thomas Jefferson by not sending a message to Congress, but addressing Congress personally, pushing for reforms. Wilson's lower tariff proposals, however, became bogged in the Senate, and Wilson sort of brought some publicity to the Senate and exposed the connection between lobbyists and the senators who benefited personally from a high tariff. And the political pressure built, and ultimately Wilson was able to get his lower tariff through Congress. It became known as the Underwood-Simmons tariff, and it reduced tariff rates on an average of about 15%. In June 1913, Wilson again addressed Congress directly, this time calling for banking and currency reform. Throughout the 19th century, after the Second Bank of the United States closed just after the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the nation didn't have a central bank. And when the economy appeared troubled, people would rush on the bank and withdraw all their money, the proverbial panics. And when everyone rushed to withdraw their money, the banks couldn't operate, and an economic downturn would result. Also, as mentioned in the Industrial Revolution lecture, farmers and the populace had been pressing for more money in the system, since this could serve as an economic stimulus, lowering employment, even as it threatened inflation. Anyway, in short, Wilson wanted a way to have the government infuse money into the banks when times are bad, stabilizing them and preventing a panic, while being able to slow the flow of money if inflation got too high. A central bank could guide the economy with its supply of money, its monetary policy. In sum, the government would have more power over the economy. The result was the Federal Reserve Act of December 1913. The legislation divided the country into 12 regions, each with a so-called Federal Reserve Bank. It also established a new American currency, Federal Reserve notes, the money we use today. In the Federal Reserve System, the 12 federal banks were not banks that private U.S. citizens could use, but rather banks where private banks would go to get loans or Federal Reserve notes from the government. It was a way that the government would infuse money into the American economy. The banks had a personal interest in the Federal Reserve banks in their region because they were required to contribute a certain percentage of their assets to the running of the Reserve Bank in their region. Overall, the Federal Reserve System was assigned to the heads of the 12 regional banks and also a Washington-based Federal Reserve Board, a presidentially appointed board whose members served for 14-year terms. The Fed, as this board became known, met 4 times a year to look at the economy in its 12 regions. If it saw that the economy was bad in one region, it would have that region's Federal Reserve Bank lower the interest rate it charged private banks to borrow money. And with lower rates, the private banks would then borrow a lot of Federal Reserve notes and then lower its own rates for private citizens. When people were charged less to borrow from their private banks, they would borrow more money and the money would be spent. It would be an economic stimulus that would drive unemployment down. At the same time, the Federal Reserve Board might notice, say, in another region, the economy was booming so much that inflation was the problem. The Fed would therefore instruct the Federal Reserve Bank in that region to raise the interest rates it charged private banks for more Federal Reserve notes. Facing higher rates, these private banks would, of course, borrow less and raise their own rates for private citizens to borrow from them. People would borrow less money, and with less money in this system, unemployment would go up, but the problematic inflation would go down. In this way, the Federal Reserve Board sort of monitored the economy using the money supply, sort of balancing unemployment and inflation, stimulating and slowing the economy when it thought necessary. Today, of course, the country has become so economically integrated, interstate commerce has become so widespread, that the nation really doesn't have regional economies anymore. If one region's booming and inflation was troublesome, it's probably true all over the entire country. It was for this reason that the Federal Reserve Board's power was eventually strengthened in the 1930s during Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Today, the Federal Reserve establishes national interest rates and fiscal policy that affect all 12 regions nationally, the economy as a whole. Wilson had promised new freedom, breaking up big businesses' monopolies, in essence to rely more on trust busting than regulation. In 1914, he moved in this direction with the Clayton Antitrust Act. The nation had, of course, the Sherman Antitrust Act, but as noted previously, it had been so vague it really wasn't as effective. The new Clayton Act, by contrast, spelled out in detail specific illegal practices, such as selling at a loss to undercut competitors that corporations couldn't do. It prevented companies, for example, from acquiring stock from another company. It was, in that way, anti-monopolistic. It certainly proved much more effective in fighting monopolies. Wilson quickly employed this new power and filed a number of antitrust suits to break up big business, and he actually broke up about 100 large corporations. During Wilson's first term, two progressive movements culminated in constitutional amendments. For years, the Supreme Court had resisted the establishment of a progressive or graduated income tax, something you recall that the populist Omaha platform had demanded. The government had established an income tax during the Civil War to cover the cost of the war, but it had been phased out in 1872. Congress had again authorized an income tax in 1894, but in 1895 the Supreme Court had called the measure communistic and unconstitutional. Proponents then began to push for a constitutional amendment, and this culminated in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. It declared that a progressive or graduated income tax was constitutional. With this decided, Congress then passed a new income tax that had rates at its high as 7% for incomes over $500,000. With the new money coming in from the income tax, Congress was able to appropriate funds to carry out all of its reforms. You also have the 17th Amendment in 1913. This amendment allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators. You recall that Article 1 of the Constitution said that the U.S. senators were elected by the state legislators, and this had made it easy for big political bosses to for corruption. They could buy a certain number of state legislators and have the senators work for them. When you have a direct election of senators, like the 17th Amendment provided for, it's tougher to control the U.S. Senate. Not all of Wilson's actions were positive from the perspective of today. Wilson was, after all, a man of his day and age, and he was, in fact, from the South. And so when he came to office, he shared his views on African Americans that many people would find repulsive. He wasn't a militant segregationist. He saw the humanity in African Americans, but he did support segregation, and he actually allowed his bureaucrats to segregate the federal bureaucracy during his presidency. This concludes the section on Wilson's progressivism early in his presidency.